I apologize, my economics class ran a little bit over there. So we are going to get started here. We'd kind of gotten into and finished up, I believe, the French Revolution yesterday. So we're going to talk about the after effects of the French Revolution a bit today. Better make sure before I do that I did indeed. I apologize. Normally I do this between classes, and I think I did. So it should be good to go to start on the second half of this, which is what happened as a result of the French Revolution, and that is the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Little fun fact here, since I'm the god of useless trivial knowledge. Bonaparte was such a big enemy of the English, and they were so scared of his military success, they were really worried they'd ever be able to defeat him in the battlefield. And so English parents, to scare their children into behaving, used to threaten them with, hey, Bonaparte is going to come get you, the bony man. And bony man somehow became the boogeyman. So when your own parents said, ooh, the boogeyman, they're actually talking about Napoleon Bonaparte, which is very fascinating to me anyway. So we talked about Maximilien Robespierre becoming the chairman of the Committee of Safety, and how pretty much he runs the French government at this point in this phase of the revolution. And despite the horrific and arbitrary loss of life that he's engaged in by people, oh, you don't agree with me? Off with your head. The committee did stabilize the French economy. It implemented numerous administrative reforms, many of which helped pay for the army fighting the coalition of foreign powers at France's doorstep, resulting in victory for the French forces and a momentary peace in June of 1794. Now, considering these achievements, Robespierre certainly believed the ends, a successful and solvent France, certainly justified his rather grisly means. In February, for instance, Robespierre gave a famous speech where he equated terror and the virtues of the French Revolution, claiming one could not be had without the other. Now, despite Robespierre's fervency, many within the French government began to oppose the terror, I think for obvious reasons. In the spring of 1794, the Committee of Public Safety's original leader, Georges Danton, stood in the convention and spoke in opposition to Robespierre's tactics. In response, Robespierre had Danton and his political colleagues arrested, and he executed them only days later for violating the principles of the revolution. The French military victory in June further made the case to many French leaders that the terror needed to end. Since the very reason for the commission of the Committee of Public Safety no longer existed, they were no longer at war, they no longer needed quick decision-making by a small body or a single individual. They could focus on domestic matters, which required the voice of the people. So this end came in July 1794, when an impromptu verbal assault of Robespierre and his deputies during a meeting of the convention led to Robespierre's arrest. And within hours, the convention declared Robespierre an outlaw. He had violated the principles of the revolution, darn it, and they executed him the following day without a trial. Ironically, the final victim of the Reign of Terror was its orchestrator. So every so often throughout history, a character comes along who refuses to be ignored. Movers and shakers like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, or obviously on the opposite side of the spectrum, Adolf Hitler comes to mind. In the tumultuous and chaotic period of the French Revolution, many such men have been deemed large enough characters to warrant articles, books, and even whole history courses. None, however, were as large as the man to become Emperor of the French Empire, Napoleon Bonaparte. And today we'll explore Napoleon's rise to greatness. We don't know a lot about Napoleon's early life, believe it or not. He was born on the island of Corsica, which, if you look on a map, is the southern Mediterranean, halfway between Italy and France. In 1769, it's north of Sardinia, which had only been acquired by France from Genoa just a year earlier. So a lot of Italians actually claim Napoleon as their own. He's the son of a poor Corsican nobleman. He attended French military school in Paris and was considered a smart student who was also a bit of a loner. However, he also had an insatiable energy and a gift for organization and planning. At only 16, he entered the French forces as a second lieutenant in command of an artillery detachment. And this is, Napoleon's military flair is really based on artillery. Napoleonic warfare is basically can be defined as heavy bombardment of artillery, followed by infantry march up the middle and cavalry clashes on the peripheries. So during the tumult of the early years of the French Revolution, Napoleon quickly rose through the military ranks and, though through some additional help from his friends in the military, found himself as commander of the French Republican forces at the Siege of Toulon in 1793. The city was held jointly by Royalist and British forces within the city, and Napoleon led the successful assault, being shot in the leg in the process, reclaiming the strategic port for France. And for his successful raid and his heroism in battle, Napoleon was immediately promoted to the rank of brigadier general. And less than 2 years later, he was appointed commander of the Army of the Interior in October of 1795. Now, the Army of the Interior is just that. The other armies would fight outside of France. Napoleon's job was to defend and protect France itself. So though his victory at the Siege of Toulon first made Napoleon famous, it was his saving of the new French government of 1795, the Directory, which solidified Napoleon's reputation. And this was ironically just after he had been removed from command by the same government because they saw him as a rival. So when a Parisian mob threatened to overthrow the fledgling Directory, which had replaced the Committee of Public Safety, Napoleon jumped to action after being implored by Paul Barras to protect the government. So Paul Barras is a politician, former military man. The mob is attacking the government. They're used to that by now. Hell, they've lived through the Reign of Terror and everything. And so Barras is like, Napoleon, you have to help. And so Napoleon brought up a small cannon piece, a few troops. He fired a round of small arms artillery into the crowd, which, as you could probably guess, dispersed it. Otherwise, you're going to get hit by grape shot, which is a canister, think like a metal coffee can filled with small metal balls like this, that when you fired the can, it exploded, and all these balls just went out in different directions. And so, obviously, kind of painful. And so you wouldn't want to stand right there where someone's firing at you. And this act reinvigorated Napoleon's military career because the director's like, maybe we were wrong removing him. He's a good guy. He defended us. And so they replaced Napoleon back into command of the French army in Italy. And there, Napoleon led an underfunded, undersupplied, and underfed force to victory after victory against the Austrians. There is no denying Napoleon's military genius. He continued his campaign westward to the point of threatening invasion of Austria itself, at which point the Austrians sued for peace in October of 1797. Victorious, Napoleon didn't stop there. Realizing Britain was France's largest enemy, Napoleon resolved to attack it. This is something that, by the way, hasn't been done since 1096 in William the Conqueror. So we're talking about 800 years, Britain has never been invaded and attacked. But with an invasion of the island likely proving disastrous, Napoleon resolved to attack British interests elsewhere. The crown jewel of the British Empire since they'd lost America was India. The way you got to India was sailing south of Africa around Cape Horn, which was very dangerous and you could lose a lot of ships doing that. Or there was an overland route. You'd go through the Mediterranean to Egypt and have stuff carried by hand a few miles to the Red Sea, which then connected to the Indian Ocean. It was a lot quicker to go through Egypt, and guess who owned Egypt? That's right, the British. So Napoleon decided, okay, they need India pretty badly. That's the crown jewel of the British Empire. We're going to cut India away from them by attacking Egypt. And so Napoleon resolved to attack British interests elsewhere and invaded Egypt and consolidated control of the territory. However, Lord Nelson's British fleet smashed Napoleon's French warships in the Battle of the Nile in 1798. And famously, Lord Nelson, Admiral Nelson, dies. But, never give up. It's one of his things that he said. And with his eastward advance check, Napoleon returned to France, leaving his army in Egypt in the midst of yet more political turmoil in Paris. The Directory is in trouble. So once back in France, Napoleon took part in a plot by a few members of the Directory and others to overthrow the existing government and replace it. Afterward, they decided to use kind of this Roman style of government, and they named 3 consuls or 3 executives who would run the entire government. And Napoleon was one of those. And he had himself named the first consul. In other words, there's 3 guys who are equal who are running the government, but Napoleon's the first among the equals. So with the political disarray in France now somewhat sorted, Napoleon turned his attentions back to France's foreign enemies. The following year, despite initial setbacks, Napoleon defeated the Austrians in Italy and was able to forge a temporary peace treaty with the British. So Napoleon controls Egypt, he controls Italy, he controls France. Additionally, Napoleon sold the Louisiana Purchase to the United States of America because he needed money, and Jefferson was more than happy to pay the $10 million to get it and expand the extent of the United States. Napoleon realizes it's pretty hopeless to send an army and defend stuff in America when he needs troops and money here in Europe. Why fight on two fronts? It's not going to work out for France. So he sold it. And with peace secured abroad, Napoleon turned to consolidating his power in Paris. He enacted several popular reforms in France and attempted to heal some of the wounds of the revolution by offering amnesty and free return to France of all French citizens who had fled abroad during the turmoil. A lot of these, especially noblemen, were pretty wealthy. And if you could bring them back, that's a new tax base, actually, for them. So Napoleon reintroduced Catholicism, though he maintained tolerance of all religions within France, but certainly Catholicism was his favorite. Most French were still Catholic, were still practicing Catholicism anyway. So additionally, Napoleon enacted a new civil code throughout all of France, which granted numerous individual freedoms and even allowed women the right to divorce, though men were still considered in control of the household, which is fairly progressive and forward thinking at the time. Napoleon's reforms and the stability he brought to the French government after a decade and a half of chaos caused him to be wildly popular in Paris and France. In 1804, they even elected him Emperor of the French via a popular referendum and a near unanimous vote. And you can think what you want about that. Historians still dispute whether these results were legitimate, since some estimate nearly half of the French population did not vote. Europe is an oddly shaped continent if you've ever looked at it on a map. It's kind of hard to determine where it begins and ends and where Asia begins and ends. Peninsulas aplenty, mountain ranges crisscrossing the land. Just getting from point A to point B can be difficult for the weary traveler. And the same problems experienced by the traveler were problems for armies trying to conquer the European landscape for centuries, which is why Europe's never been really united for most of its human history. Add that to the immense diversity of its people and climate, and some military historians have surmised that Europe in its present form is unconquerable. That notion, however, hasn't stopped several people from trying, including the hero of today's story, Napoleon. One of the best efforts, and the only one made from France, was actually made by Napoleon in the first decade of the 19th century. Indeed, soon after Napoleon was consecrated by the Pope as the Emperor of France in December 1804, Napoleon began making plans for the conquest of Europe, and particularly his chief rival, Great Britain. Now, in opposition to these plans, however, stood a coalition of three major European powers who didn't particularly want to be conquered by Napoleon, and these allies were Austria, Britain, and Russia. And these grand plans had an inauspicious start, as Napoleon could not attack Britain without first doing away with its massive fleet and clearing a path across the English Channel for an invasion force. And realizing that an open sea battle with the British fleet would likely prove disastrous because they were the best navy in the world at the time, Napoleon devised a plan to raid the British colonies in the West Indies, hopefully drawing the British fleet across the Atlantic, which would clear the channel for Napoleon's invasion. However, the British admiral we already talked about, Lord Nelson, beat back the joint French and Spanish fleet before they could even attempt a crossing, and the French forces retreated to Cadiz, where the British fleet later crushed the French fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. And this battle gave the British supreme control of the seas, solidified their position as the best navy in the world, and Napoleon was forced to shelf his planned invasion of Britain. In response, Napoleon advanced where he knew his forces were superior, on land. 2 months after France's calamitous defeat at Trafalgar, Napoleon's eastward advance across Central Europe was met at Austerlitz by a much larger Russo-Austrian force. Napoleon concentrated his best troops in the center of his formation and smashed the Russians and Austrians. Now, before this, you got to realize military tactics required you taking the flanks. And so most people would concentrate their best forces on their right, which means the other side facing you, their best forces are on their right to defend. And so everything usually happened on the right side of the line. The left, would certainly fight against each other, but you wanted your best forces on the right. Napoleon said, I'm not going to put my best forces on the right. Let them come around me, because with the speed of my forces going up the center, they'll end up chasing me, and I'll make forward progress and destroy things. And so this was, not a new thing. Alexander the Great had used the same tactic, but and certainly with the technology of the day and artillery, it was a lot more effective. And that was, the benefit of Napoleonic warfare. So as a result, the nominal status of the Holy Roman Empire was eliminated. The Holy Roman Empire is no more. And France carved out of it a territory called the Confederation of the Rhine, which in theory was an independent state, but in practice, all these little states that made up the Confederation were all vassal states of Napoleon's France. But this is going to have an important political and historical thing, because they soon learn about working together, all these little states within a kind of a unitary government. And so they learned later on they're going to unite into Germany. This is their first taste of how to do that. Much like for America, the treaty or article, and the name escapes me, of what Benjamin Franklin tried to put together was kind of the first taste. That Stamp Act, not the Stamp Act Congress, but the trade organ. I'll remember later, I'm sure, but you get the idea. Additionally, the Austrians were forced to surrender their Italian holdings to France. So now, again, Napoleon controls all of Italy, Switzerland, France, big chunk of modern day Germany, and is going to work his way through Poland, actually. This is huge French empire here. The huge expansion by France into Italian and German lands alarmed the rest of Europe, in particular Prussia, who would hope to be kind of the leader of these German peoples. And they now had an expansionary France at their doorstep threatening them. And in July 1806, Great Britain, Russia, and Prussia formed the Fourth Coalition. And Prussia invaded the Confederation of the Rhine in September. The Prussian invasion, however, was immediately repulsed by Napoleon's forces, and by the end of October, Napoleon was marching into the Prussian capital, Berlin. This is going to have huge, huge psychological implications on the Germans for years to come, because what's going to happen in a few years, in 1840s, is Prussia is going to invade France, and they're going to form the country of Germany. They're going to propose it and form it in Versailles itself. Now, the French are upset by this, that they marched in there. So during World War I, the French really want to tear apart Germany and cause it all kinds of harm, which leads to Adolf Hitler coming in World War II and wanting to punish the French for all this. And that all starts here with Napoleon marching into Berlin. So Napoleon continued his eastward advance into territory that had formerly been Poland, but was now controlled by Russia. And forced to answer this incursion into their territory, the Russian army met the French forces at Friedland in June 1807. The Russian forces were smashed, and as a result of the defeat, Tsar Alexander I was forced to negotiate with Napoleon or risk further invasion. And as a result of the Treaty of Tilsit, France gained large parts of Prussia and created the Duchy of Warsaw, which revived the Polish state that had been broken up in the 18th century. And this state, too, proved to be a puppet regime controlled by France. And though this upset Alexander, he had few other options because Napoleon was just so mighty, basically. Napoleon's seemingly unstoppable march eastward was not meant simply to gain territory and vassal states for the expanding French Empire, though. As Napoleon conquered more and more territory in Europe, he hoped to destabilize and choke Britain off from its traditional trading partners on the continent. And if you can't invade them militarily, invade them economically and choke them off so that their military continues to weaken, and then maybe you get the chance to invade them in total. So in his 1806 Decree of Berlin and 1807 Decree of Milan set up the Continental System, whereby no neutral state or any state allied to France was allowed to trade with Great Britain, effectively setting up a blockade of the island without having to send out a fleet. Great Britain similarly planned to counter-blockade, blocking any states from trading with France, specifically the United States. And this, in turn, was one of the main causes of the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain, because Great Britain was boarding ships, checking to make sure you weren't trading with France, American ships flying the American flag, violating our sovereignty. And what's worse is they're short of sailors. They would board American ships and just go, you know what, you're a British citizen, you're not American, and they would just take you and force you to serve in the British Navy, what's called impressment. So though the Continental System spurred some labor unrest and caused skyrocketing unemployment in Britain, most historians contend the system hurt the French far more than the British. Not only did it hurt regions economically dependent on trade, but its enforcement also stretched Napoleon's troops thinly across the continent. So the expansion of Napoleon's France into Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe inspired nationalist response in many of the territories Napoleon conquered. For example, the German philosopher J.G. Fitch wrote his address to the German nation in Berlin, attempting to inspire nationalist indignation at their French overlords. And this work is viewed as the nationalist catalyst for the unification of a later German state. Instead of being just a bunch of principalities and little countries, they started to recognize we have a lot in common. I mean, we all speak German. We all have similar historical things. Being part of the Holy Roman Empire has built a culture that we're all very similar. Why not unite into one nation? So growing anti-French and pro-Iberian sentiments grew in Spain and Portugal as well, specifically after Napoleon implemented the continental system. A series of revolts took place in Madrid and elsewhere in the peninsula, forcing Napoleon and his troops to have to fight in several regions, and in the capital, Madrid, a conflict which lasted several years and altogether became known as the Peninsular War. Capitalizing on these sentiments, Austria declared a war of liberation for the peoples of Europe against the French Empire in 1809, and was joined by yet another coalition of Britain and the rebels in Spain. And despite these nationalism-fueled responses to French rule, there was no end to the empire in sight, as France continued to expand, annexing the Papal States in 1809 and Rome itself in February 1810, which means that Napoleon pretty much controls the Catholic Church now. France further annexed Holland in July, and the fateful decision that likely turned the tides of Napoleon's empire was Russia's fateful decision in December 1810 to break the continental system and resume trade with Great Britain, because Russia was in desperate need of British grain exports. They'd had a famine, a bad harvest that year, and Britain, and particularly Egypt and the Nile, provided them a lot of stuff. Of course, they weren't controlling Egypt at the time, but India and everything, lots of agricultural goods. They had an excess that they were trading. So in response, Napoleon spent the entire next year planning and preparing an invasion of Alexander I's Russia, a punitive expedition to punish them for trading with Great Britain. And so now Alexander has no choice. He's either going to let his people starve and die, or he's going to risk them dying in war. So literature is full of characters whose pride and vanity are their ultimate downfall, whether it's the hubris of Oedipus Rex or Dr. Frankenstein. Literature teaches us that sometimes the very ambition which has led a character to greatness can also ruin them if they don't humble themselves. And this is what's true of Napoleon with his Russian invasion. Napoleon wants to punish them for going against him, and he's going to make them pay. It's kind of prideful, isn't it? I mean, okay, they do something to save their people, but that's not what you want, so you're going to punish them. So in the same way, truth is sometimes stranger than fiction. History has numerous great figures who are brought down by their own blind egotism, and thus it is with Napoleon. And few can match the arrogance and ultimate fall of France's first emperor in this regard. Napoleon's intentions were not a well-kept secret, and in May of 1812, Russia, Sweden, the Spanish rebels, and Great Britain formed the Sixth Coalition to oppose Napoleonic France. The following month, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River, which had been set in 1807 as the boundary between Russian territory and French-controlled states. Napoleon's armies advanced slowly across the Russian countryside, unable to gather supplies along the way as the Russian army burnt crops and towns as they retreated. In other words, the French army is so far away from their supply lines, they were dependent on being able to forage in the local territory. But the Russians, it's called slash and burn. They were burning everything. Now, did it hurt them? You bet it did. But it hurt the French a lot worse because they're a lot farther away. At least the Russians can look to what's ahead and then burn it, but their supply. So Napoleon's armies advanced slowly across the Russian countryside, unable to get these supplies. His first major battle of the campaign was the Battle of Borodino. It proved successful, though his army took heavy casualties in winning the clash. The battle laid Moscow open to Napoleon and his troops. Moscow is the capital of Russia, and so everybody's fleeing Moscow, leaving it, including the Tsar and his family. And his army took heavy casualties in winning the clash to get to Moscow, but they did manage to get to Moscow in September, and he found the city deserted and in flames. They had burnt the city down. And with little else to accomplish in Russia and his supply train too strung out to maintain a winter camp in the city, Napoleon was forced to retreat from Moscow in October. Now, if you know anything about Russia, you should know it is a cold, dreary, snowy freaking place. And what happens is Napoleon leaving in October, that's actually winter in Russia. And so he is leaving in the middle of a Russian winter with hardly any supplies, tired troops, not having achieved his objectives. And he lost scores of troops to frostbite and disease on the way back to France. Napoleon's nominal victory, what we'd call Pyrrhic victory in Russia, weakened the French cause against Russia more than the burning of the capital helped. And soon after Napoleon returned to Paris in December of 1812, Russia promised to help Prussia regain the territory the Prussians had lost in the Treaty of Tilsit, and Prussia promptly declared war on France as a result. And despite early French successes against this alliance, there were problems elsewhere. The commander of the British Army, who would later become the commander of all the Allied forces themselves, was the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke. And he arrived in Spain to lead the Spanish rebels who had intermittently fought French control in Iberia since 1807. Additionally, Austria joined the anti-French coalition in August of 1813 after negotiations between Napoleon and the great Austrian statesman Metternich broke down. At the Battle of Leipzig in October of 1818, the Allies dealt Napoleon's army a severe defeat. And by the end of the month, Napoleon's armies were retreating all across Europe. By December, nearly all of the French territorial gains of the previous decade had been erased. By early 1814, the Allies were invading France itself, and in March, one of Napoleon's chief generals, Joachim Murat, defected to the Allies. Paris surrendered by March. In the first week of April, the French government deposed Napoleon from the imperial throne, and only a few days later, Napoleon officially abdicated in favor of his son, who actually happened to be the King of Austria's grandson, because he had married and had a child with Austrian king's daughter in the hopes of Austria gaining peace with Napoleon. He further agreed to exile on the island of Elba off the coast of Italy as his prison. In response to the end of the French Empire, the powers that had defeated Napoleon convened in the Congress of Vienna in September of 1814 to determine how the territories France had conquered would be divided. And the Congress of Vienna is kind of a precursor of Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill meeting at Yalta to determine the course of the world after the war. This is what the Congress of Vienna was doing. What should the world look like, particularly France, after the war? So the main objective of the Congress was to divvy up territory in a way that pleased all the parties and created a balance of power such that pan-continental conflict would become impossible again, because everybody would be scared of everybody else because they were all equal in power. That's the objective of the Congress of Vienna. Additionally, the Congress sought to restore the French Bourbon monarchy, return the borders of Europe as much as possible to its pre-1793 boundaries, and eliminate the possibility of events such as the French Revolution from happening elsewhere in Europe. In other words, it's very monarchical. It wants to make sure that monarchies rule and that the people answer to the monarchies, but in order to maintain the rule of the monarchies, they have to allow some rights to the people in this regard. So the Congress was moderately successful in that Prussia's borders were expanded to check French power in Western Europe. Matter of fact, they gained that Alsace and Lorraine territory. And all sides managed to avoid a major war until the Crimean War in the 1850s. The expansion of the Prussian borders would also serve, however, as one of the proximate causes of the world wars of the 20th century. But this was not the last Europe had heard of Napoleon, unfortunately. France's economy had remained weak, and the restored Bourbon monarch Louis XVIII was unpopular with the people. Now, you might be wondering, what happened to Louis XVII? Well, when Louis XVI was beheaded, his son was still alive, even though he was only alive for a couple more days before he was beheaded. So technically, his son was Louis XVII. His nephew is Louis XVIII, Louis XVI's nephew. Napoleon saw his opportunity and seized it. He returned to France in March 1815. He escaped Elba and marched an army of disaffected French soldiers who still loved the guy into Paris only 3 weeks later, where he was greeted as a hero and proclaimed Emperor of France yet again. Now, naturally, the former allies immediately formed a new coalition and invaded France. And Napoleon's quick mobilization of France was remarkable, made the initial defense of his position possible. However, he chose poor ground to fight on. Actually, Wellington got to choose the ground, and it was very advantageous for him. It's in modern-day Belgium. It's at a place called Waterloo, and he suffered decisive defeat at the hands of the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815, which doomed Napoleon's second reign. By July, the Allies were back in Paris, and Napoleon was exiled once again to the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic, and he had armed guards there all the time. It really was a prison in this case, and he died there in 1821. So that's Napoleon. I'm going to end that there today, and then tomorrow we'll kind of finish up the 18th century and talk about that. Did you have any questions today for me?
So whatever happened to his son?
Napoleon's son?
Yeah.
He actually went back to Austria with his mother, and he died fairly young. I mean, he was given a nobility title in Austria, but no one ever really talked about him being Napoleon's son. And he died in his early 20s from natural causes.
So he never really got to rule.
No, never done. Now, when we get to the 1840s, what we'll talk about is Napoleon's nephew comes to power. So you've got Napoleon. His son would have been Napoleon II. His nephew becomes Napoleon III, and Napoleon III causes a lot of problems as we get into the 1840s. So we're not through with the Bonaparte family yet.
And what was it? So it was what were the three countries again that grouped up? They decided after Napoleon and his army was defeated and he was kicked out of France.
The Congress of Vienna, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, well, certainly it was Great Britain, Austria. Austria kind of took the lead in this. One of the princes of the sons of the king, a guy named Metternich, was kind of really instrumental in this. So it was Great Britain, it was Prussia, it was Austria, it was Russia, and Spain that were kind of the players in the Congress of Vienna.
And they kind of decided on
They decided what Europe would look like post-Napoleon. They divided it up. They created some new countries. They got rid of some countries. But they decided, okay, here's what Europe's going to look like. And we're going to try what's called the Concert of Europe. And we'll actually get into that in the next unit. The Concert of Europe was a way to make sure that all the European powers were fairly equal, and they could, so that no one would fight each other because it would interrupt this balance of power. Now, the one thing they did not consider, and the powerful European group they did not include, is going to be what ends the Concert of Europe, and that's the Ottoman Turks.
So would that be, though, kind of the thing of Vienna? Is that
Congress?
The Congress of Vienna, is that what they decided on? Is that what it looks like today because of that?
In large part, yes. In large part, yes. And the idea of this balance of powers is going to play heavily in World War I with the League of Nations, and they're deciding, okay, what's the world going to look like? And then the United Nations after World War II, after the Yalta Conference, what's the world going to look like to encourage peace? But every time there's one area that actually, what the Ottoman Turks, yes, they're in Europe partially, but where's their major influence? The Middle East. In World War I, after they do it, they divide up the Middle East. World War II, they divide it up even more and try to give it freedom. So every time it's kind of the Middle East that's leading to these problems and how you design the world. And of course, how do you design the world? How do you say some people deserve a country and some people don't? And that's kind of be the downfall of all three of these major organizations.
Okay. That's kind of all the real questions I had.
Okay. All right. Well, so I'm going to end the class today if nobody else has any questions. And I appreciate you coming today. And we'll see you tomorrow at the same time.
Yep.
You guys have a good day.